Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for spending your dinner hour with us here at the UCLA Health Forum. And I'd like to welcome you here. And I think it's going to be a very interesting and hopefully enlightening hour and a half as we talk about value and costs and other top-of-mind issues with a focus on cancer care. So I'm going to introduce myself first before the rest of the panelists, but before doing that, just wanted to thank our sponsors for their generous support of this forum. Without our sponsors, it would not be possible to hold these events. And you can see the list of sponsors. I won't read them all now, but again, thank you very much to them. The other thing I wanted to mention is, as I introduce myself, normally Dr. Paul Torrance would be here to introduce the forum. He sends his apologies for not being able to be here, but I will do my best Paul Torrance imitation. Another person who couldn't make it actually is Dr. Josh Kaufman. He was originally going to moderate this panel, and he works with me at Amgen. So again, he sends his apologies for not being able to make it due to being somewhat under the weather. So you're probably saying, well, then who is that guy? So my name is Dr. Martin Zagari. I work at Amgen, about an hour and a half north of here, and I'm the Vice President for Global Health Economics and Technology Assessment at Amgen. So I've been there about 10 years. I'm actually a physician by training, but I transferred kind of over to the research and outcomes side of healthcare and medicine about 20 years ago. And I worked in consulting. I worked for Johnson & Johnson for 8 years, and I've been with Amgen for about 10 years. And although in the US, these notions of value and health economics and HTA are relatively new, and we'll talk a lot about that in the next hour and a half, I've been actually working globally in this area for 20 years where it's pretty routine to talk about these things. So hopefully, although we'll talk a lot about the US today, I'll bring in some global perspective as well. Let me introduce briefly the rest of the panel because I know that many of you came here to see the interplay between the panelists and then to ask Q's and A's of the panel. So what I'll do is I'll introduce each briefly. And then I will give a longer introduction as they come up to the podium so it's fresh in your minds when they actually present their information. And the slides are slightly out of order. So as you can see, Dr. Kaufman is not here, although some people say we have some resemblance to one another, passing resemblance. But anyway, he sends... Not in height. Probably not in height. So he sends his apologies. So our illustrious panel is sitting right here in the front of the room. And again, I will make a few remarks at the beginning, but then we will have each panelist come up in turn. And we are extremely fortunate to have a panel that represents a broad swath of expertise across the healthcare space. And so Dr. Robert Dubois, who is the head and Executive Vice President and Chief Science Officer of the National Pharmaceutical Council, is here with us. Dr. Darius Lakdawala, who works here at at USC, at the school, what's that? Yeah, to be very careful. At the USC School of Public Health and at the Schaefer Center, where he is a professor there. And Jennifer Mallon, Dr. Jennifer Mallon, who is also a clinician by training, but now works with Anthem Health and actually directs a lot of the patient-oriented activity there. So essentially, it is a fantastic group to talk about essentially our topic tonight, which is the cost and value of cancer care and where we've been and where we're heading. So I'm going to open it up with a few remarks from my perspective, and you can consider my perspective to be perhaps the perspective of the innovator. I work for Amgen, which is a biotechnology company, and cancer is actually one of the major areas that we're thinking about the trajectory over the next couple of decades of innovation. And so actually, I'm going to start by taking kind of a macroscopic view, right? Because I realize that during the course of this discussion, a lot of the topics could become pretty granular, where we talk about the price of certain therapies, or we talk about pressures on the healthcare system today. But what I'd like to do is sort of back, way up and look through what I call the macroscope. And rather than talk about drug X versus drug Y or drug prices, I really want to talk a bit about kind of the value of disease treatment as it accrues over years or even decades. And I think that those of us who work in the drug industry, those of us who do research and outcomes research, those of us who work for insurers, those of us who work often are focused on a clinical trial or some fairly discrete data points. But I think when you back up and, for example, look at the last couple decades in this case of improvements in health that have been wrought in an area like cancer, that's when you really begin to get a perspective, a broad perspective of maybe what the word value, really means. And so I think there's, no argument that we've made progress in cancer. We've made tremendous progress compared to where we were just 20 and 30 years ago, and we continue to make critical breakthroughs. People are leading longer, healthier, and more productive lives, and that, again, is a definition of value that I would offer as a very important one, the value of treatment to patients. The success rates for drugs have actually gone up. Now, we have plenty of failures in my industry, but actually the fact that we have pressure in the system regarding new drugs and how we pay for them actually does represent a remarkable success rate in the industry. And in fact, the FDA has recently released some statistics about drug productivity, which looked like it was going through a worrisome nadir, during the 2008, 9, 10 period, but I'm happy to report has actually bounced robustly back, and I think 2015 was the biggest year for drug approvals I think the agency has ever had, and so that is fortunate. That's fortunate for the patients with the increasingly serious diseases that these specialized medicines treat. When you actually take an epidemiologic look at cancer, we see that cancer death rates have fallen by about 20%. And those gains are not shared, unfortunately, equally across all of cancer. There are some areas where we've made great progress in prostate, progress in lung, and in myeloma, but not all tumors have shared in those dramatic improvements. And another thing I think is important to recognize that when you actually look at all of the variation in healthcare, one of the reasons, why these improvements come about is the change in what we can offer patients. So about 80% of survival gains are in fact attributable to innovations, many of them biotechnology innovations, but also some device as well as diagnostic innovations as well. So I point to this macroscopic perspective because I think in looking at trials and in looking at headlines and in looking at how we afford things right this moment, it's instructive to look back. Now, what does all this cost us? It's costing us, in cancer, about 1% of the national healthcare expenditure for the drugs that we are approving and getting into use, and it's about 20% of overall cancer costs. A number has been increasing, but has been relatively stable over the last 10 years or so. But it's interesting, and so now I'm zooming into a different level, which is, okay, how is the discussion taking place today? And these are just some of the headlines about value. And so most of the time when value gets discussed now, it's actually not about the macroscopic picture that I offered on the first slide. It's about a little bit more of a granular view, that looks at what's happening today. And I think that's important to differentiate between the two, because the notion of value can be defined differently in different ways by everyone in this audience. There's an important kind of quality and determination of of how value is calculated, and that is the perspective of value. So for example, you can take the payer perspective of value, right? And you can look at actually the flow of revenues out, revenues in, premiums paid, physicians' fees covered, hospitalizations covered, right? And that could be seen as one measure of value. That's very different from the patient perspective of value, which essentially may look at things not related to costs because they're not actually experiencing the full costs of healthcare. What are they experiencing? They're experiencing, well, some of the costs, but they're experiencing survival gains, quality of life improvements, the other thing that healthcare brings about. So I offer those differing perspectives because every headline out there has a perspective behind it and has essentially a lens that they're looking at value. And I think for us to be good consumers of kind of value headlines and to be a good kind of participant in those discussions, we have to kind of know about that perspective. And so what are the types of things we're seeing? Well, we're seeing a lot of talk about the current cost and escalating cost of healthcare. But I would like to point out that there are some things that kind of enrich this story, and I think we'll touch upon some of those today. First, in the talk about prices of drugs, I think people sometimes overlook that it's not just the price of medicines that's going up, it's the price of everything in the healthcare system that's going up. And in fact, the price of medicines is relatively stable at about 13% of total national expenditure of healthcare. And so I think we don't just have an issue of drugs that are becoming, sort of headlines, sort of expenses for non-affordability. I think we have a value issue to look at across our entire system. Hospitalizations, the rate at which we hospitalize, right? The types of tools and diagnoses we use or don't use is a huge determinant of the value of treating a disease like cancer. Another thing that's not generally focused on by the headlines is what sort of drives the innovative drug industry, which is the kind of relentless expiration of patents on old medicines. And I could, if I had a longer period of time, I could show data that 90% of patients actually get a generic medicine when they go to the pharmacy and have a prescription dispensed. And that ability to essentially, for 90% of patients to access very inexpensive medicines is in fact what funds the continued advancement of the breakthrough medicines that are coming for a disease like cancer. So there's a lot of ways you can sort of look at value, that you can look at the story, right, of drug expenditures. And I just wanted to sort of bring people's attention to the fact that there is a lot of nuance, right, behind any discussion of cost and of value. The other thing I wanted to mention is kind of this notion of, again, backing up and looking at a macroscopic perspective. One of the headlines that you've probably read recently that I didn't put up on the slide, who's heard of the moonshot that we want to basically have on cancer? Anyone heard of that? A couple people have heard of that. Well, in the press recently, President Obama and Vice President Biden have essentially redeclared the war on cancer, but I think the war analogy's grown a bit tired, so they've called it now a moonshot on cancer, which I think is a fantastic headline, right? I think it should be very encouraging to everyone in this room that we are renewing the fight against cancer. But it was very interesting. I was on another call the other day where we were actually talking about the costs of cancer care, and there was essentially a lot of discussion about how, well, in order for our healthcare system to be sustainable, right, we're somehow going to have to cap these costs, right? We're somehow going to have to maybe even roll back those costs to put, mechanisms in place to control prices. And I thought about the moonshot, right? And I, thought back to, okay, what did it take to send someone to the moon, right? And I think when you look back, we invested, I believe, as a country, about 10% of our entire national budget. I don't know if it was exactly that statistic, but it was a huge figure for multiple years. I think it was 2 to 3% of GNP, right, to essentially achieve this huge goal. So when I think of a moonshot-like event in cancer, I think, wow, if we really want to achieve that, we're going to have to invest something, right? Rollback and moonshot on cancer are probably not something that are kind of mutually compatible. And so I think if we really want to cure cancer, we can't be thinking of a moonshot that's going to be totally cost-free, risk-free, right, and essentially easy, right? It's not going to be any of those things to do it. So I think we have to decide, what we want, right, and look out in the future. And so this slide actually takes maybe a more national perspective, because I think what's important in these big discussions is to have that big perspective. There are 300 million people living in the country, and when you look at 2 decades of cancer care, right, studies have indicated that we've saved millions of years of life, and if you value those years at a reasonable health economic value, you get to trillions of dollars of value. So those are the types of numbers we're talking about. We're talking about moonshots, we're talking about trillions in value, and all of that is dependent on the decisions we make today, right, about what we're going to afford, right? And so our panel is actually going to be discussing, and so I'm going to, sort of give you a preview a little bit. They're going to be discussing methods about how we assess value. They'll be discussing techniques of how to basically put value into perspective. They'll be discussing some of the pressures on the current healthcare system, and they're going to offer a lot of examples about value. So hopefully this primer on both, sort of microscopic as well as macroscopic value, serves to frame that. And so again, on the moonshot, let's just, look at pie in the sky, or actually this isn't even pie in the sky. This is saying, well, what if we reduce cancer-related deaths by another 1%? You saw that we had reduced the death rate by about 20%. So if we look at 1%, that's worth about $500 billion in societal value, right? So I think these are big numbers. They're sometimes hard to wrap one's head around. But again, I think when you look at what we've achieved in a couple decades and the stakes for the next couple decades, I think talking about disease-level economics is an important place to be. Didn't realize it was a build. Great. I would like to put in one final plug for a little bit of what I would call U.S. exceptionalism. And there is a call in some groups to bring in a European style or of health technology assessment. Well, why can't we just borrow from other countries and just assess technologies the way they do? Well, I think that type of system probably, I would argue, is not the system for the U.S. We as a country are in a unique position to actually change the global trajectory of healthcare. Most innovation comes out of this country from our industries. Most innovation in surgical techniques and medical treatments and medical progress in general owes a disproportionate thanks to what's done in this country. And so while other countries are pretty much price takers and they buy kind of resource for healthcare on the open market, they can't change the trajectory like I've shown you here, right? If you're in Romania and you're the Romanian healthcare minister, you can't declare a war on cancer, right? Or you can't probably declare a war that's actually going to work, right? We can do that, right, in countries like the U.S. And I think, we do have the unique position of being the world's innovation engine in healthcare. But I think it's more than just the responsibility to continue to be an innovator. We actually get value out of that innovation. Because when you look at the countries in Europe that do not allow innovation to essentially percolate through their healthcare systems, you do see dramatic differences in cancer death rates. You see differences in the UK, but you also see differences in Germany, where the spend on healthcare is somewhere between the US and the UK examples. So I would argue that those folks who argue for an intense focus on drug prices and intense health technology assessment also have to take into account that those types of restrictions and controls do ultimately have an impact on outcomes. All right. So I'm going to move on. First of all, I want to thank you for attending this forum. And at this point, I want to begin introducing the panelists who will each come here as well and share what I know will be a different perspective from mine. So let me first introduce Dr. Darius Lakadwala. So as I mentioned, Dr. Lakadwala is Quintile's chair and professor of pharmaceutical development and regulatory innovation at the School of Pharmacy at the USC. So hold your applause for later for USC. He is also a faculty member at the Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics at USC. Now, he is uniquely qualified to talk about economics, risk to the healthcare system, incentives and the effects of medical innovation, as well as the economics of health insurance market, all of which are critical, obviously, to sustaining innovation. You're published widely. You've won multiple awards, and I think you're the perfect person to kick off our panel and to essentially talk about your perspective on value. And so I welcome you up here, Dr. Lakadwala.